welcome. I'm Jeff Resnick, Senior Historian here at the National Library of Medicine and the National Institutes of Health. Thank you very much for joining us for today's National Library of Medicine History Talk. NLM's History Talks promote awareness and use of NLM and related historical collections for research, education, and public service in biomedicine, the social sciences, and the humanities. NLM History Talks also support the commitment of the NLM to recognize the diversity of its collections, which span 11 centuries, encompass a range of digital and physical formats, and originate from nearly every part of the globe. Moreover, NLM History Talks foreground the voices of people of color, women, and individuals of a variety of cultural and disciplinary backgrounds who value these collections and use them to advance their research, teaching, and their learning. So welcome, everyone. And for those of you who wish to share questions with our speaker this afternoon, please look for and use the live feedback button that you see underneath the video stream. Today, I have the great pleasure and privilege of introducing Dr. Rachael Gillibrand, who serves as Lecturer of Inclusive Learning for the Schools of History and English at the University of Leeds in the UK. Previously, Dr. Gillibrand spent 2 years teaching history and heritage studies at Aberystwyth University in Wales, during which time she was simultaneously employed as the Japrit Verdi Fellow for Disability Studies at the Medical Heritage Library. As Dr. Gillibrand explains on her website, quote, "As a woman from a working class background and the first in my family to attend university, I am deeply committed to extending and improving inclusivity practices and thinking critically about how the student experience can be improved for students from traditionally marginalized backgrounds within academia." Long preoccupied with the past and fascinated by the history of the body, Dr. Gillibrand decided to pursue history as a career. She completed her BA in history, her MA in medieval studies, and her PhD in medieval disability studies at the University of Leeds. And throughout her doctoral research, she has investigated the practical ways in which 15th and 16th century disability aids were designed, constructed, and sold, while also considering how contemporaries conceptualized body augmentation and the day-to-day use of assistive devices. These themes variously inform her current research and related open access outputs, which include an article entitled "Digitized Collections and Disability Histories" in the quarterly publication of the Association for Librarians and Information Professionals in the Social Sciences, and a talk in the Medical Heritage Library Spring Speaker Series, as well as curated primary source materials also for the Medical Heritage Library. Notably, NLM was one of the founding members of the Medical Heritage Library, along with several other esteemed libraries around the United States. So today, Dr. Gillibrand joins us to draw in part on these research outputs in her presentation entitled "Visionary Technology, Exploring Eyeglasses and Impairments in the NLM's Collections." Dr. Gillibrand, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us from Leeds, and looking forward to your talk.
Thank you for such a warm introduction, Jeff, and for having me to speak this afternoon or this evening, depending on where you are. So for the next sort of 40 minutes or so, I want to talk a little bit about my research into the pre-modern history of eyeglasses, which I'll be referring to as eyeglasses, glasses, or spectacles, transferably throughout the presentation. So the invention of spectacles during the pre-modern period presents a pivotal moment in the history of assistive technologies. Spectacles made a real difference to the lives of people who had visual impairments, but especially those people who were scholars, scribes, and those who are engaged in professions involving close work. However, spectacles became more than just tools for improving vision. They took on symbolic meanings in medieval art and literature, representing things like wisdom and learnedness, and conversely, foolishness and inappropriate behaviour. The talk I'm going to give today will talk about not just the early history of spectacles, but some of the pre-modern medical discourse surrounding them, and the way in which spectacles acted as a visual metaphor in pre-modern imagery and artwork. But before we get on to all of that, let's just start with the origin of spectacles. So, the first documented reference to spectacles can be traced to a sermon delivered by the Dominican friar Giordano da Pisa in 1306 at the Dominican monastery of Santa Maria Novella in Florence. In the sermon, Giordano stated that, quote, "It's not yet 20 years since there was found the art of making eyeglasses, which make for good vision, one of the best arts and most necessary that the world has. And it's so short a time that this new art, never before extant, was discovered. End quote. Giordano mentions then that spectacles had been invented within the last sort of 20 years or so of his sermon, and so that places their origin around about the late 1280s. Much like the glasses that we're familiar with today, medieval spectacles were made of two framed circular lenses. However, unlike modern spectacles, these lenses were held together by a rivet that acted as a hinge. This allowed the user to be able to fold them in half, which would help them to store them neatly in a case, and that case was often hung from a belt. They have no arms to rest on the ears, like we might expect from a pair of glasses, but instead they had to be either held up in front of the eyes when in use, or clipped somewhat precariously onto the nose using the hinge. There are a couple of surviving examples on the PowerPoint. So these glasses are a sample from the only known surviving cases of medieval spectacles that have their lenses intact. And they were found in a 1953 archaeological dig under the choir stalls at Wienhausen Nunnery in Germany. This excavation found 3 complete pairs of spectacles, of which there are 2 on the PowerPoint there, as well as multiple sort of damaged fragments. And all of these were made from either leather or wood and dated from between the 14th and 16th centuries. The images on the PowerPoint show 2 different but very popular kinds of what we call rivet spectacles. So the ones on the left are sort of traditional rivet spectacles. You can see that they have a sort of slight opening at the bottom through which they could be prized apart to fit the lens in, and this was then sealed with a piece of linen thread. And they've got that rivet at the top where you would insert a rivet to allow that hinge mechanism. On the right of the PowerPoint, we have a slightly different design. These are bow rivet spectacles, and you can see here that they are a little bit more curved in that bow shape at the top. And this seems to be to give them a bit more help sort of holding onto the nose and allowing them to be worn on the face more comfortably. It's also worth noting at this point that from the 13th to 15th centuries, spectacles were only capable of correcting long-sightedness. So while some can inherit this problem genetically, for most people it's a consequence of aging or work-related eye strain. The result of this condition is that people don't have the ability to see objects nearby as well. They tend to be out of focus, but they can see objects in the distance much more clearly. So to jump back to Giordano, so shortly after Giordano had given his sermon praising spectacles, one of his contemporaries, who was also a Dominican friar called Alexander della Spina, used an existing pair of spectacles to work out the process of construction, and he revealed this to the public. So in academia, we're always promoting open access, and della Spina was also doing this very early. So in the Chronica Antiqua Conventus Sanctae Catharina de Pisis, it stated that, quote, Friar Alexander della Spina, a modest and good man, whatever he saw that had been made, he knew how to make it. Eyeglasses, having been made by someone else who was unwilling to share them, he made them and shared them with everyone with a cheerful and willing heart, end quote. However, even with della Spina sharing the methods by which spectacle lenses and frames could be constructed, for around the first 100 years of their existence, spectacles were a relatively specialist luxury piece of equipment. Because of this, the people who were most likely to be found wearing them were those who were simultaneously wealthy enough to be able to afford them, but also engaged in activities that would render their use necessary. Therefore, in the years sort of immediately following the invention of spectacles, the main beneficiaries of this new technology were scholars and scribes whose professions required them to spend long hours bent over desks, reading and writing in dimly lit environments. The work of medieval scribes provides a really valuable lens through which to examine the practical impact of spectacles on pre-modern life. Scribes played a crucial role in medieval society, painstakingly copying text by hand in the scriptorium of monasteries and religious institutions. Their work was physically demanding, often involving long hours of writing in dimly lit environments that contributed to eye strain and other physical ailments. A poignant example of this kind of physical toll that was experienced by medieval scribes can be found in a 9th century copy of the Codex Thessalonius. In this, a cleric named Rodolfo, who worked on the manuscript, included a colophon, so a kind of annotation outside of the text, in which he laments on the hardships of his scribal work. And he says, quote, "Oh, how heavy the writing. It arches the back, it makes the eyes foggy, and it breaks the stomach and the ribs. And you, brother, who read this book, pray for Rodolfo the cleric, God's servant, who wrote in the atrium of St. Agan." End quote. So Rodolfo's words speak to the bodily toll of manuscript production. He draws attention to the link between his work as a scribe and the physical suffering that this causes him. He also explains how writing for extended periods affected both his body and his eyes. His work causes him such significant joint pain and eye strain that he requests all who read his work pray for him specifically. It's possible that if Rodolfo had only undertaken this kind of work occasionally, his injuries would have been uncomfortable but brief. Having adequate time to rest between periods of writing would have helped to alleviate his symptoms. However, as a cleric, Rodolfo was probably engaged in manuscript production on a very regular basis. By frequently putting his body under this kind of strain, Rodolfo's acute impairments could have become more chronic in nature. The physical challenges of manuscript production were also exacerbated by the poor lighting conditions in which scribes worked. In 1939, Florence Elder de Ruver suggested that, quote, "ordinarily work by artificial light was not permitted within a scriptorum because of the greater possibility for errors or poor writing and the dangers of casualties to the costly books from grease and fire," end quote. And she says that subsequently scribes were only permitted to work during daylight hours. This, however, doesn't seem to be true when we sort of investigate into some of these scribal colophons. There are a number of these manuscript annotations that complain about writing at night or by low lamplight, again suggesting that this rule was not followed in practice. For example, in a 9th century commentary on Cassiodorus' Psalms, a scribe included a marginal annotation in vernacular Irish complaining that the light of the candle is not bright. Continuing to work then by candlelight was arguably worse for the ocular health of scribes than ceasing to work when the natural light had faded. Focusing on small detailed work for extended periods of time in low or flickering light would likely have led to eye strain, blurred vision, and ultimately presbyopia. Based on the damaging effect of reading and writing in low light for these extended periods, it makes sense then that most of the accounts we have of spectacle use, at least in the early days of spectacles, relate to churchmen, friars, and scholars, as these would have been the people most likely to experience early onset presbyopia and to have subsequently purchased and used spectacles to enable them to continue their work despite their declining vision. As a result then of their early relationship with scholars and scribes, spectacles came to serve as a visual metaphor for intelligence, wisdom, and scholarly achievement in medieval imagery and artwork. Symbolic use of spectacles was not limited to those who'd used them in life either. Instead, spectacles were employed as a tool by artists to signal to viewers that the individual depicted was a certain intellectual or scholarly status, irrespective of whether they were known to have worn glasses in reality. As Hillman and Maud explain, bodily is notoriously difficult to theorize or pin down because it's mutable, in perpetual flux, different from day to day and resistant to conceptual definition. This corporeal resistance definition presented a challenge to medieval image makers who were asked to represent elements of an individual's character, status, or life experiences through portraiture alone. To help readers kind of understand a body, the people depicted in these images were sort of built into a network of visual signs, including things such as objects, hairstyles, types of clothing, and certain colours to demonstrate the attributes of a particular individual. A common and very well-known example of this can be seen in the inclusion of a golden halo, be that in the shape of a ring, a disc, or a sunburst, around the head of an individual to indicate that they are of holy or sacred status in Christian iconography. And spectacles came to operate in much the same way. It didn't matter whether a person had used them during their lifetime, but instead they're included as a visual metaphor that people viewing an image were able to interpret and that could be used to impose a stable interpretation of an otherwise mutable body. And there's a notable example of this in the Nuremberg Chronicle, which is an illustrated encyclopedia produced in 1493, and of which the NLM holds a copy in their collections. In this text, we find a woodcut illustration of the Persian physician and philosopher Abu Bakr al-Razi wearing spectacles, or at least holding spectacles up before his face. Al-Razi was known for his contributions to a wide range of medical fields, including the treatment of diseases and the study of anatomy. His works were foundational in both the Islamic world and later in Europe. He wrote comprehensive texts such as the Kitab al-Hawi, translated as the Comprehensive Book, which brought together the medical knowledge of his time and offered critical insights that influenced future generations of medical practitioners. However, he lived approximately between 865 and 925 BCE, which is almost 400 years before the invention of spectacles. He would never have seen spectacles, let alone used them as this image implies. But that's not the point. The point of the inclusion of spectacles in this depiction of Al-Razi was not intended to be historically accurate, but rather to symbolize his intellectual status. The glasses tell the viewer that Al-Razi belonged to the kinds of groups that academics and scholars would have belonged to, and who would have been wearing spectacles, struggling with that one today, in the early days of their invention. As such, the glasses are not to be taken literally, but to be read as a visual signifier of Al-Razi's status as a respected academic. And this tradition of associating glasses with wisdom has persisted across the centuries and has transformed into a modern-day trope where glasses function as a recognisable marker of intellect in popular culture. You might be familiar with characters such as Velma in Scooby-Doo, Leonard in The Big Bang Theory, and even Clark Kent, Superman's alter ego, who are all depicted as wearing glasses as a visual shorthand for their intelligence, analytical skills, or academic prowess. In each case, the glasses contribute to the character's identity. So Velma's glasses emphasise her role as the brains of the group, Leonard's reflect his scientific intellect, and Clark Kent's symbolise not just his intelligence, but also as a way to distinguish his kind of more mild-mannered persona from his superhero alter ego. Even in these comedic or satirical contexts, the trope remains powerful today, reinforcing this long-standing link between visual impairment aids and intellectual insight. As we move through the medieval period and into the early modern period, the production of glasses became much more mainstream, and they suddenly became available to a much broader range of people. Oh dear, where are we going there? There we go. As they became more widespread, they began to attract the attention of medical professionals. Early medical texts, however, reveal a kind of ambivalence towards the use of glasses. While there was an acknowledgement of their utility, there was also a concern that their use could lead to a deterioration of natural vision. The first medical recommendation of glasses appears in Guy de Chauliac's Inventarium sive Chirurgiam Magna. De Chauliac, who lived between 1300 and 1368, was a prominent French surgeon whose work greatly influenced medieval medicine. He served as a physician to several popes in Avignon, and is best known for his comprehensive medical text, Chirurgia Magna, which he wrote in around 1363. And again, this is something that the NLM holds a copy of. This treaty became a foundational work in medieval surgery, covering a wide range of medical practices, from things like wound treatment to surgical instruments, and blended classical knowledge with his own clinical observations. His writings remained a key reference in European medicine for centuries to come, and his emphasis on things like empirical observation helped advance the field of surgery. But for this talk, what I'm interested in is his thoughts about glasses. So in this text, Guy de Chauliac advises the use of spectacles only as a last resort. He says that we should only turn to them if all of the medical attempts to improve one's vision have failed, stating that, quote, if these things, by which he means medical treatments and surgeries, are of no avail, recourse must be given to the glass or beryl spectacles, end quote. It's interesting here that Guy suggests beryl as an alternative to glass, which was the most popular choice for lenses at that time, because beryl was a natural mineral that was a kind of more opaque crystal than glass, and it had a greenish tint. However, despite its lower optical quality, it was this green hue which made beryl a desirable substitute for glass. In his History of the World, written around 77 to 79 CE, Pliny expounded the benefits of looking upon emeralds to heal and soothe strained eyes. The idea that looking upon the colour green could soothe a person's eyes continued to hold currency long after Pliny and well into the medieval and early modern periods, and consequently affected the reading and writing cultures of the time. For example, Peter of Spain, who was part of the 13th century learned interest in optics, wrote a treatise on optical health called De Oculis. In this, he explains that, quote, green is beneficial, end quote, and that emeralds can help the eyes. He also states that when designing a hospital, rooms in which there are patients ought to be painted green. Beds also ought to be green and pleasant to the sight. If looking at green could help to combat eye strain and improve one's well-being, barrel spectacles would have been doubly effective. Not only did they help individuals to overcome the degeneration of their vision, but they also provided this calming hue through which any up-close work, reading or writing, could be viewed, thereby anticipating and ideally preventing any ocular irritation that these activities might cause. However, this distaste for spectacles by medical professionals and the suggestion that they should only be used in extremis persisted across the medieval period and into the 16th century. In 1563, George Bartiche published his Ophthalmologica, the first known treatise dedicated specifically to the ophthalmic health and eye surgery. The text is incredibly innovative, not just in its subject matter, but also in its presentation. It includes, for example, 92 woodcut illustrations demonstrating various ocular diseases, surgical methodology, and instruments. The NLM holds a copy of the Ophthalmologica dating from 1583, from which the image on this slide is drawn. However, while Bartiche advocated for ocular health and ocular medicine, he was staunchly against the use of spectacles. He states that, quote, it is much better and more beneficial that one not require spectacles. It is much better for a person to preserve 2 eyes than one should have 4. When it happens that some people say they see better through spectacles and eyeglasses, better than otherwise, consider this core of a habit than as an affliction or deficiency of the eyes, end quote. His critique is accompanied by the woodcut on the slide, which shows a gentleman wearing a pair of rivet spectacles to read a book. On the table in front of him is an alternative spectacle design, commonly referred to as goggles, which we might recognise today. The glass in the goggles was not shaped as carefully as that in spectacles, and so similarly today, these devices served a more protective function rather than the ability to aid with long-sightedness. However, despite the medical advice discouraging the use of spectacles, their sale and use increased exponentially over the 15th and 16th centuries. In his book, Renaissance Vision, Vincent Elardi accounts for the export of 24,000 pairs of spectacles from Venice to Turkey between April and September of 1540. These spectacles would then go on to be sold by a range of individuals, from merchants and market stall holders to travelling peddlers and goldsmiths making bespoke frames for imported lenses. The NLM's collections contain this really excellent image from around the year 1600, which comments on the sale and use of spectacles. As you can see in the image on the PowerPoint, a shop on the left-hand side sells pre-made glasses and lenses, as well as cases to protect them. An elderly man tries on the spectacles at the optician's stall, but as we look around, we start to realise that almost everyone else is also wearing glasses, including a scholar who's there in a doctoral cap at the front of the image, a bookseller keeping his accounts, a seamstress sewing, a cobbler preparing leather, and his apprentice stitching shoes. The only adult who is not wearing glasses or not using some kind of optical aid is the blind man in the background with a guide dog, and the spectacle seller themselves. The text at the bottom of the image reads, in translation, glasses have been invented that remove the more obscure darkness from the eyes. And what I find really interesting about this image is that it could be read in one of 2 ways. On the one hand, and as it's often spoken about in academic scholarship, it could be said to be promoting the sale of spectacles as something useful to all professions. Everybody has a pair, and the text seems to imply that the glasses are doing their job in obscuring and removing the obscure darkness. However, it could also be read as satire, and I think this is a more interesting interpretation. The person who isn't wearing spectacles is the person selling them and promoting them, which says something about his confidence in his goods. And the fact that the sort of text suggests that they are removing the more obscure darkness from the eyes could be a little bit tongue-in-cheek, as a spectacle seller is sort of technically pulling the metaphorical wool over his customers' eyes by selling them faulty or ineffective goods. And it wasn't unusual for spectacle sellers to be presented as immoral or deceitful in some way. Another example of this can be seen in a Netherlandish engraving by Peter van der Heyden from around about 1570, entitled The Festival of Fools. The fools in this engraving can be seen engaging in a number of typically foolish behaviours, such as dancing in a circle, playing loud musical instruments, and publicly urinating into a bowl, as well as, in the lower right-hand corner, wearing and perhaps selling spectacles. What makes this image especially interesting is its connection with the poem written in the lower border, which outlines all the different kinds of fools and the activities they're participating in. The third stanza states, in translation, "Foulest numbskulls waste all their substance. There are some who take others by the nose. Some of them sell trumpets, others sell spectacles, with which they deceive many nimwits." Although the author of the poem remains unknown, it's generally acknowledged that the meaning of the engraving is closely linked with the text placed directly beneath it. Consequently, it's possible to suggest that the fool who's depicted as holding a pair of spectacles aloft, who's found in the lower right-hand corner of the image, and I've blown up so you can see a little bit more clearly on the right-hand side of the PowerPoint, is representative of the fools in the poem who sell spectacles with which they deceive many nimwits, quote. Not only does this suggest that the person selling the spectacles is a fool, but it also implies that those who purchase them are foolish for allowing themselves to be deceived. The reason spectacle wearers were considered fools is because from the 14th century there began to develop a concern that spectacles had the power to manipulate the ways in which people saw the world, for example by making items appear magnified or distorted, and that therefore prevented people from viewing an objective truth. As the contemporary Italian physicist Vasco Ronchi suggested, the aim of vision is to know the truth. Eyeglasses make figures look bigger or smaller than they would be seen with the naked eye, nearer or farther away, at times distorted, inverted, or coloured. Hence, they do not make the truth known. They deceive and are not to be used for serious purposes. It's possible then, if spectacles were made from glass with a lower optical quality, or if the curve of the lens was too great or too little, or the user was myopic rather than presbyopic, that spectacles could indeed distort one's view of the world in the manner that Ronchi suggests. As we've seen, working with spectacles requires, use of different kinds of glass or crystal. We've got the beryl that is of a lower optical quality, whereas we have glass of a higher optical quality. And even then, that has to be shaped into lenses with the correct level of curvature in order to function without distortion. It could take a person's eyes a little while to adapt to using spectacles, during which time they might experience a kind of warped peripheral vision. And so it's likely then that the fear of spectacles distorting one's vision was based on people's experience of having used poorly made spectacles or not having taken the time for their eyes to adapt to spectacle use. As well as concern over spectacles leading to the distortion of one's vision, there was also a fear that wearing spectacles could gradually worsen one's vision. And this is a really difficult theory to disprove because in many cases, eye conditions like presbyopia are degenerative and they continue to steadily worsen regardless of whether or not a person wears spectacles. However, it's usually when people wear spectacles that they first start to notice a decline in the quality of vision. And so it's really possible to see how spectacle use could be conflated with the natural degeneration of vision. Despite the reasons or validity behind claims that spectacles could harm a person's vision, the idea of spectacles as a symbol of foolishness persisted throughout the Middle Ages. So, as I mentioned earlier, while spectacles were often used as a visual metaphor for learnedness, By the later Middle Ages and into the early modern period, they also became a signifier of foolishness. And this dual meaning can make it really difficult for us modern scholars to determine whether the inclusion of spectacles in an image is meant as a praise or a critique. Therefore, it's important to consider other contextual factors to understand the intended message of the spectacles in an image. So from around about the 14th century onwards, spectacles begin to appear in depictions of fools, that is, individuals who are being presented as in some way intellectually or morally deficient. Fear that spectacles could distort one's vision and prevent an accurate view of the world fed into the idea that those who wore them were easily deceived and or lacking in common sense. Sebastian Brandt's Narrenschiff, the Ship of Fools, is an excellent example of spectacles being used as a symbol of folly. The Narrenschiff is a German satirical poem that was first published in Basel, Switzerland in 1494. The poem is illustrated by a series of woodcuts, copies of which, like the one on the slide, are held in the NLM's collections. In the first of these illustrations, the one on the slide, a fool, indicated by his cap decorated with bells and donkey-shaped ears, sits at his desk surrounded by books. He peers into one of these books through a pair of rivet spectacles. In the poem accompanying the woodcut, the fool says, quote, "Although my Latin isn't fine, I know that vinum stands for wine. Bookless a cuckold, stultus fool, and I am doctor, that's my rule." In this image, the fool's spectacles draw attention to his misplaced focus. He uses his books to learn inappropriate things, such as the Latin words for wine, cuckold, and fool, rather than seeking true or legitimate knowledge. Brandt's use of spectacles in this context critiques those who misuse their intellectual resources, suggesting that true foolishness stems not from reading, but from reading and focusing on the wrong kinds of things. It's also significant that this is the first fool to appear in Brandt's poem. Brandt uses the fool to critique those who are looking up inappropriate things in books, and yet the reader of the text is themselves spending their time reading about fools in a book. So this subsequently casts the reader in the role of the fool themselves. And fools are not the only individuals for whom spectacles are used as a visual signifier of inappropriate behaviour. Spectacles are also used to mock religious individuals for looking at or participating in things that are unsuitable to their position. In these instances, the individual's behaviour and associated ocular impairment demonstrate their distance from God. An example of this can be seen in a manuscript miniature located in a late 14th century copy of Conrad van Amenhausen's Der Schassel. This is a morality text that was written by Jacobus de Chrysolis in the sort of early-ish 14th century. In this illustration, we see an image of a tonsured and bespectacled monk who's playing dice with another man. The monk's opponent is intended to represent a lower status or unsavoury character. His hose are falling down, he has a hole in the toe of his left boot, and he's depicted with wild red hair and a red forked beard. These signifiers tend to be anti-Semitic in nature and were frequently used in contemporary Western imagery to represent both Judas as an individual and Jewish people more broadly. Engaging in gambling would have been against the monk's religious upbringing, as contemporary school texts and ecclesiastical rules told young clerics to stay away from, quote, dice and malicious women. There's little doubt then that by gambling with this roguish opponent, the monk depicted in Das Schasselbuch is focusing his attentions on the wrong kind of activity. As the manuscript is a morality text, originally written by a Dominican friar, it subsequently makes sense that the inclusion of spectacles was intended to critique the monk's behaviour, indicating that he should be applying himself to Holy Scripture rather than a game of dice. Another and final example of this can be found in a 14th century French psalter. In this psalter, an illuminated initial D shows 4 tonsured monks reading from a prayer book in front of a cloth-covered altar. While the 3 monks at the front of the group are looking at the text in front of them with sort of scowls of concentration, the bespectacled monk at the back of the group is wistfully staring over his shoulder and away from the prayer book. Spectacles in this image are then used to critique the wearer's inappropriate behaviour. Unlike his pious brothers, who are actively engaged in reading the holy text in front of them, the monk at the back shows that his mind and eyes have wandered away from the religious responsibilities before him. Spectacles are used in this image to demonstrate that the monk should be applying himself to the holy text rather than idle daydreaming. It's also possible that this image served a dual purpose and acted as a warning to the reader whose eyes had wandered away from the central text of the manuscript to focus instead upon the marginal illustrations. In this case, the monk's distraction actively mirrors the potential distraction of the reader, with his spectacles acting as a caution against misplaced attention. So to briefly wrap up then, the history of spectacles in the pre-modern period reveals their dual function as both practical tools and powerful cultural symbols. Initially a luxury item used by scholars and scribes to alleviate the effects of presbyopia, spectacles soon became associated with wisdom and learning. However, as their use became more widespread, they also attracted criticism and skepticism from medical professionals who feared that they could distort vision and accelerate the deterioration of natural eyesight. Moreover, spectacles took on a satirical dimension in visual culture, where they were often used to symbolize foolishness or intellectual and moral failings. The development of spectacles highlights the broader tension between the benefits of assistive technologies and the anxieties that they provoke. As spectacles became more accessible, they reshaped not only how people saw the world, but how they were seen by others. This complex legacy continues to influence the ways in which we think about vision, knowledge, and technology today. Thank you.
Dr. Gillibrand, fantastic talk and excellent research and wonderful visuals. Excuse the pun. And I did not know Velma's last name. So I learned something besides all of your fantastic research. In all seriousness, a wonderful talk. And I have several questions for you. And we do have time for questions for Dr. Gillibrand. So for those watching, please use the live feedback button under the NIH VideoCast stream to send your question. Those questions will come to me and I will triage them on my screen right here and ask them to our speaker. So Dr. Gillibrand, thank you again. Let's start off with this question. Spectacles were seen as symbols of both wisdom and foolishness. Was this duality present in other forms of assistive technology of the times?
Well, so I think this is really interesting. And the answer is sort of yes and no. So we certainly see different kinds of assistive technology carrying different connotations when they're used by different people throughout the time period, and especially in things like visual culture, as well as in life. I think another good example of this can be seen in representations of people using early wheelchairs. So wheelchairs as we understand them today didn't really exist in the Middle Ages. The urban environment and the landscape just didn't function for those two sort of large wheels on the side of a chair. Instead, they looked a little bit more like an adapted wheelbarrow because that could push through more uneven landscape. But when we're looking at images of these kind of adapted wheelbarrows and proto-wheelchairs, we see that it was far more acceptable for women to travel in these devices than men. I think this is really interesting because it says something about gender and expectations about gender and disability. I think it was Christine de Pizan who said that women have sharper minds but more delicate bodies than men. So it was acceptable to show a woman being transported in a sort of proto-wheelchair because, they were more delicate, it was more kind of appropriate. But it would have been really emasculating for noble men to be travelling in that way because it would demonstrate a kind of delicacy or fragility that was associated with feminine behaviour. So while it's not wisdom and foolishness, we do see that kind of dichotomy in representations of other forms of assistive technology.
Thank you. So this is a question partly about spectacles as material culture. You mentioned the discovery of spectacles from the medieval period. Can you speak more broadly about the number and kinds of spectacles that have survived and are available for study? Has anyone ever undertaken an inventory of these surviving objects to help advance our understanding about them?
Yeah, so I don't think there is a formal inventory. Hopefully, when my book comes out in the next couple of years, which is on sort of 5 different kinds of assistive technology, and there's a chapter in there on spectacles, that will sort of fill that gap a little bit. But there's very few surviving examples. There are the ones from the Wienhausen nunnery, which have the 3 full examples. And there's another set from an excavation of Trigg Lane in London. But unfortunately, because they're made from largely sort of organic materials, things like wood and leather, they just don't survive to the present day. They disintegrate and decompose, and glass is, fragile and it breaks. So the actual number of surviving examples is really limited, which is why visual culture is so useful. That we've got these artistic representations of spectacles, in the wake of the kind of paucity of material evidence.
Noted. Thank you. Thank you. And looking forward to your book one day. Several have written in that they've really appreciated your talk, calling it fascinating and really enlightening. Another question, I wonder if you know anything about the use of handheld lenses over the same centuries, what we call magnifying glasses. This person writes in, I believe they were often used by the painters of manuscript illuminations. By chance, have you seen illustrations of these objects being used? And thank you very much.
Yeah, there's loads of them out there. There's various optical devices at this time. There's also sort of glass globes of water that would be put over text to act as a kind of magnifying glass in kind of the pre-glasses period of ocular aids. In fact, there's a chap on the PowerPoint slide, the first page, who's holding a magnifying glass up to his eye rather than a pair of spectacles. So lots of images of magnifying glasses being used.
Thank you. Another question, do we have any evidence that suggests belief that degradation of sight, and therefore the need to use spectacles, might have been caused or worsened by erudition or excessive reading?
I mean, not from the Middle Ages. I've not seen any sort of writing about excessive reading causing the degradation of sight from a medieval perspective in textual form. But the modern research into sort of degradation of sight absolutely confirms that excessive reading, especially in poor lighting conditions or reading on a screen in the dark, that kind of thing, or reading without wearing necessary spectacles to make it easier on your eyes, can quicken the pace of ocular degeneration. I think even though it's not written about medically, medieval people seem to have been aware of this in the sense that in the early days of spectacle use, the people who are predominantly depicted wearing them are learned figures. I just finished writing an article which should hopefully be out soon, which specifically looks at images of the evangelists wearing spectacles, which makes a lot of sense because of their association with, writing the Gospels and undertaking that big sort of writing task, even though they lived long before the invention of spectacles. So I think there was an awareness of this, but I've never seen it in medical texts.
Thank you. Not a question, but a lovely comment that has come in. Thank you for such an incredible talk. This person writes, it's helpful to me working in computation to be reminded how complicated and nuanced our relationship to assistive technology has been, especially towards seeing our relationship to technology now with a little more compassion for our difficulty sorting out. Thank you so much. So, another person writes in, Benjamin Franklin is credited with inventing bifocals, which enabled people to wear their glasses for prolonged periods for reading and distance vision. Many technologies appear simultaneously in different places. Was Franklin really the first with bifocals, or did they develop independently in other places as well?
I couldn't tell you. I don't know. Benjamin Franklin is a little after my time and sort of area of research, so I'll have to dig into that one. I can't help you there.
Fair enough. Um, are spectacles used differently in different religious contexts? I know you spoke a little bit to this, but this person writes in, for example, Christian versus Jewish depictions. And have you ever come across depictions of angels or saints wearing spectacles?
Yeah, so a lot of the images that I look at are produced by um, Christian creators, by sort of monastic scribes. So I've not really dug into Jewish manuscripts and texts in the same way. So I wouldn't like to make a kind of statement on that front. But I have seen the occasional image of spectacles being used in a similar way in Jewish manuscripts in things like Haggadahs. But like I say, I've not dug into that in a huge amount of detail, so I wouldn't want to make a kind of broad assumption that it is the same. But I can say I've spent a lot of time looking at saints wearing spectacles in the Christian tradition. And yeah, you see it really often, and especially, like I say, with images of saints who are particularly sort of focused on reading or writing of religious texts or treaties. So you've got the evangelists, and they're a really interesting case because Matthew, Mark, and Luke all frequently appear wearing spectacles, but John doesn't. And there's not time to discuss this now, but I think that's largely because he's also presented as the sort of more youthful member of the evangelists. And so you've got two visual signifiers there that are at conflict with one another. One is his youth, and one is the idea that if you spent a long time reading and writing holy texts, then you would be of an age where your eyes are degenerating, wearing spectacles as a necessity. And those two are at odds with each other. So we don't see John wearing spectacles, but we do for the other three. Also later saints as well. So people like St. Augustine are often represented wearing spectacles as well, or having them sort of in their vicinity. So you might see these portraits with sort of spectacles on the desk, so they've just been taken off or used.
Mm. So this prompts me to ask just a follow-on question about that, Dr. Gillibrand. What about depictions of women wearing spectacles? You mentioned Christine de Pizan, and having studied her briefly when I was at the University of Rochester, I don't recall her wearing spectacles, but you did reference her. What about her contemporaries in that particular period or others?
I think this is where it gets a little bit more complicated. So we have those spectacles from the Wienhausen nunnery, and we know that they were all found sort of in the gaps between the seats in the choir where the nuns would have sat. So we can assume that those belong to the nuns, and that's interesting to me because it implies that the glasses were simultaneously important enough for the nuns to carry them on their person. They probably wouldn't have needed them in the choir. They'd have had one large kind of book to sing from or speak from in front of them all, which wouldn't that would be fine for long distance. So you wouldn't necessarily need them. So it's interesting that they were still carrying them on their person, but interesting that they also weren't pulling apart the choir to dig the glasses out when they dropped them down the sides of the seat, which I think sort of says something about the sort of the worth of glasses. So there's evidence of women wearing them there. And then really the problem comes down to thinking about female literacy rates in the Middle Ages. So women weren't working really as scribes or academics or people who were producing texts. So they didn't really fit into that early category of spectacle users. But as they become more mainstream, we see images of women who are seamstresses, who have, caught up on use of spectacles and who are making use of those. So yeah, ties in very much to women's work and women's jobs and women's literacy as well.
Thank you. So we have time for one more question. And how does the historical skepticism towards spectacles resonate with current concerns about technological advances affecting human perception?
So I think
Big question.
And it's nice to bring it back into the present day as well. So I think
Yes.
when we study history and study things like medieval history, which feels a very long way away, it's nice to think about the present day implications and what we can learn from it in the present. For me, I think the sort of long-standing concern about how new forms of representation can distort reality and manipulate perception most strongly resonate with our current anxieties around things like AI generated images and their potential impacts on um, human perception. So just as spectacles were critiqued in the medieval period for potentially deceiving audiences, new technologies today, so things like AI generated images, they, I suppose, challenge our understanding of authenticity. We've got all these new advancements in deepfake technology and these generative models like DALI and Midjourney, which really kind of like blur the line between real imagery, quote unquote, real imagery and fabricated imagery, which has promoted this kind of skepticism in the popular mindset about the validity and veracity of visual information. And so I think, yeah, this fear about AI manipulating perceptions very much aligns with the early fears around spectacles as something that spread misinformation in a way and have the potential for visual manipulation. I don't think it's too dissimilar there.
Thank you. And a great question to conclude on. And on behalf of my colleagues here at the National Library of Medicine, we thank you. And everyone watching, of course, thank you for a wonderful talk. We wish you all continued best in your research and look forward to your future book and remaining in touch. So thank you again, Dr. Gillibrand, for taking the time to prepare this talk and being with us this afternoon, and for you in the evening in Leeds. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
We will keep in touch. And to everyone watching, thank you very much. I'd like to just conclude by not only thanking you, but mentioning that our next history talk is going to be on Thursday, November 7th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. We're going to be welcoming Dr. Nam-Hee Lee, who is research professor at the Ewha Institute of History at the Ewha Women's University in South Korea. She will be speaking on In the Pursuit of Mental Well-Being, Robert H. Felix and his role in the establishment of mental health in America. So please join us on November 7th at 2 p.m. In the meantime, we thank you again for tuning in to Dr. Gillibrand's wonderful talk. Please do be in touch with us at the National Library of Medicine if we can be a resource for you in your research, your teaching, or your learning. And we bid you a great afternoon, and thank you again. Bye-bye.